Hello and welcome to Night Historian. Tonight we turn our attention to the galley, a warship that dominated the Mediterranean for more than 3 centuries, from the 13th century onward. The galley was not the largest vessel ever built, nor the most heavily armed by later standards. Yet it shaped empires, determined the fate of trade routes, and decided which civilizations would flourish and which would decline into obscurity. Before we begin, I ask only this. Take a moment to like and subscribe. It sustains this work. I am also curious if you are willing to share where in the world you listen and at what hour. Drop your location and time in the comments. I read them all. The story we are about to explore is one of engineering and ambition, yes, but also of suffering and sacrifice. It is a story written not only in wood and iron, but in the bodies of those who propelled these vessels across open water. It is a story about power, how it is built, how it is maintained, and what price is demanded of those beneath it. Dim the lights, let the outside world recede, and let us journey together into the world of the galley, where design met brutality and innovation rested upon human endurance. The Mediterranean in the 13th century presented a problem that no existing vessel could adequately solve. The sea itself was the obstacle. Narrow passages between islands, shallow waters near coastlines, sudden shifts in wind that left sailing ships becalmed for days. Merchant vessels required protection from pirates and rival powers. Yet the galleys of antiquity had long since vanished from living memory. What remained were fragments of knowledge, scattered references in old texts, and the practical necessity of innovation born from desperation. The galley emerged not from a single moment of invention, but from a gradual convergence of needs. Venetian and Genoese merchants required vessels that could navigate the treacherous waters between their home ports and the trading centres of the Levant. These waters demanded something fundamentally different from the cogs and carracks that dominated northern European trade. A ship needed to move swiftly, even when the wind failed. It needed to turn sharply in confined spaces. It needed to carry enough cargo to justify the expense while remaining maneuverable enough to escape or engage hostile forces. Byzantine naval architects had preserved certain principles from the ancient world. The dromon, a Byzantine warship that flourished in the 10th and 11th centuries, maintained the concept of oar-powered propulsion combined with sail. When Byzantine power declined and Mediterranean trade shifted westward toward Venice and Genoa, these principles migrated with it. Shipwrights in the Adriatic and the Aegean adapted what they inherited, discarding elements that no longer served practical purposes and emphasizing those that did. The fundamental insight that shaped the galley was this: in confined waters, oars provided more reliable propulsion than sails alone. A vessel dependent entirely on wind could be stranded, vulnerable, unable to pursue or escape. Oars, by contrast, responded to human will. They could propel a ship forward regardless of weather conditions. They could maneuver it with precision. This principle became the foundation upon which galley design rested. The earliest medieval galleys, appearing in Venetian records around the 12th century, were relatively modest vessels. They measured perhaps 90 feet in length, with a beam of roughly 20 feet. Over subsequent generations, they grew larger and more refined. By the 15th century, a typical galley might stretch 120 feet or more, with a proportionally narrow beam that gave it a distinctive silhouette. This elongated form was not arbitrary. The length-to-beam ratio of approximately 6:1 created a vessel that could move swiftly through water while remaining stable enough to carry cargo and crew. The shape itself reflected a clear understanding of hydrodynamics, though the shipwrights who designed galleys would not have used such terminology. The narrow profile reduced water resistance. The relatively flat bottom allowed the vessel to navigate shallow coastal waters where deeper drafted ships could not venture. The bow came to a sharp point, both for aesthetic reasons and for practical ones. A pointed bow cut through water more efficiently than a blunt one. The stern rose higher, creating a castle-like structure that provided defensive positions and protected the steering apparatus. What distinguished the galley from other Mediterranean vessels was the integration of multiple propulsion systems. A galley carried a mast, typically a single mast positioned roughly amidships, which supported a large lateen sail. This sail could catch wind from various angles, allowing the vessel to tack and maneuver in ways that square-rigged sails could not. Yet the sail alone was insufficient. The galley's true power came from the rowing deck, a long, narrow space running the length of the hull where oarsmen sat in carefully organised rows. The rowing deck represented a revolutionary approach to naval propulsion. Rather than positioning rowers in a single tier as ancient triremes had done, medieval galley designers experimented with multiple configurations. Some galleys employed rowers seated in a single row, each man pulling an oar of considerable length. Others arranged rowers in groups, with multiple men pulling a single large oar in coordinated rhythm. This arrangement, called the scalocchio system, eventually became standard. It allowed for greater power output and more efficient use of limited deck space. The choice of materials reflected both availability and necessity. Galleys were constructed primarily from wood, oak for the structural frames, pine for the planking, elm for components that would contact water. The Mediterranean provided these materials in abundance, though the finest timber came from forests in the Balkans and Asia Minor. The hull was built using a technique called shell-first construction, where the outer planking was laid first and the internal framing fitted to it afterward. This method, inherited from ancient shipbuilding traditions, created a strong, flexible hull capable of withstanding the stresses of ramming and combat. The reinforcement of the bow represented perhaps the most critical design innovation. A galley was not merely a transport vessel, it was a weapon. The bow was strengthened with multiple layers of timber, creating a structure capable of withstanding tremendous impact. Some galleys incorporated a ram, a reinforced projection extending from the bow at or slightly below the waterline. This ram could splinter the hull of an opposing vessel, or at minimum, create enough damage to disable it. The ram was not a new invention. Ancient triremes had employed rams for centuries. Yet medieval galley designers refined the concept, making it more effective and more integral to the vessel's overall design. By the 14th century, the galley had evolved into a standardized form that would persist for the next 300 years. Venetian shipyards established specifications that other builders imitated. A galley of this era measured approximately 130 feet in length, with a beam of about 20 feet and a draft of 5 to 6 feet when fully loaded. It could carry between 150 and 250 tons of cargo, depending on configuration. More importantly, it could be propelled by between 150 and 250 oarsmen, giving it speed and maneuverability that no other Mediterranean vessel could match. The evolution from ancient galley to medieval form was not a simple progression from inferior to superior design. Rather, it represented an adaptation to changed circumstances. Medieval galleys were built for specific waters, specific purposes, specific economic systems. They reflected the needs of merchant republics that required both cargo capacity and military capability. They embodied the technical knowledge available to shipwrights, working within the constraints of medieval materials and tools. They represented a solution so effective that it would dominate Mediterranean warfare and commerce for centuries to come, until changing technology and shifting trade patterns rendered them obsolete. To stand before a completed galley in a Venetian or Genoese shipyard was to confront an object of deliberate complexity. The vessel presented itself as a unified whole, yet every element served a specific function within an intricate system. The hull itself, that curved wooden shell stretching 130 feet or more, represented the foundation upon which everything else depended. Shipwrights understood instinctively what modern naval architects would later prove mathematically. The shape of the hull determined how efficiently the vessel moved through water, how stable it remained under stress, and how well it could withstand the forces that combat imposed upon it. The construction process began with the keel, a massive timber running the entire length of the vessel's bottom. From this keel rose the frames, curved wooden ribs that gave the hull its shape and structural integrity. These frames were positioned close together, sometimes only a few feet apart, creating a skeleton of considerable strength. The planking was then fitted to this framework, with each plank carefully shaped and fastened to its neighbours using wooden pegs and iron nails. The overlapping planks, a technique called clinker construction, created a hull that could flex slightly under stress rather than cracking under pressure. This flexibility proved crucial when a galley struck another vessel or when waves subjected the hull to sudden violent forces. The underwater portion of the hull received particular attention. The keel extended slightly below the main hull line, providing lateral resistance that prevented the vessel from sliding sideways through the water. The bottom was relatively flat compared to the rounded hulls of northern European ships, allowing the galley to operate in shallower waters and to beach itself when necessary. This shallow draft came at a cost. The galley was less stable in rough seas and more prone to rolling in heavy swells. Yet for the confined waters of the Mediterranean, where sudden storms were less common than in the Atlantic, this trade-off proved acceptable. The bow rose sharply from the keel, coming to a point that cut through water with minimal resistance. This pointed bow extended above the waterline, creating a structure called the forecastle, a raised platform that provided space for soldiers and archers during combat. The forecastle was not merely decorative, it served as a defensive position from which defenders could rain arrows or projectiles upon an approaching enemy vessel. Below the waterline, the bow was reinforced with additional layers of timber, creating a structure capable of withstanding tremendous impact. Some galleys incorporated a ram at this point, a reinforced projection that extended forward at or slightly below the waterline. The ram was not a separate attachment, but rather an integral part of the bow structure, formed by the convergence of heavily reinforced timbers. The stern presented a different configuration. It rose higher than the bow, sometimes reaching 30 feet or more above the waterline. This raised stern castle provided multiple advantages. It offered defensive positions for archers and soldiers. It housed the steering apparatus, the large rudder and tiller mechanism that controlled the vessel's direction. It provided shelter for the captain and senior officers. The height of the stern also served a practical purpose. It kept the stern higher than the bow, which helped prevent water from swamping the vessel when it was moving forward at speed. The midships section, the area roughly amidships where the beam was widest, contained the rowing deck. This was the true heart of the galley, the space where the vessel's propulsive power originated. The rowing deck extended nearly the full length of the hull, interrupted only by the mast and the structures at bow and stern. The deck itself was not a solid platform, but rather a series of benches and supports arranged to accommodate the oarsmen. The arrangement varied depending on the galley's size and the system employed, but typically each oarsman sat on a bench, with his feet braced against a footrest and his hands gripping an oar that extended outward through an opening in the hull's side. The oars themselves were remarkable pieces of engineering. A typical galley oar measured between 30 and 40 feet in length, with a blade at the outer end and a grip at the inner end. The oar was not a simple pole, but rather a carefully shaped implement, thicker and stronger near the grip where stress was greatest, tapering toward the blade. The weight distribution was crucial. An oar that was too heavy would exhaust the rower, while one that was too light would lack the power to move the vessel effectively. Oar makers, specialists in their craft, understood these principles through experience and experimentation rather than through formal calculation. The mast and sail system complemented the rowing capability. The mast, typically a single pole of considerable height, was positioned roughly amidships, slightly forward of centre. It was stepped into a socket in the keel and supported by stays running to the bow and stern. The sail itself was a large lateen sail, a triangular design that allowed the galley to sail at various angles to the wind. Unlike the square sails that dominated northern European vessels, the lateen sail could be trimmed and angled to catch wind from multiple directions. This flexibility made the galley far more maneuverable under sail than larger square-rigged vessels. The rigging that supported the mast and controlled the sail consisted of ropes and lines running throughout the vessel. These lines were made from hemp or other plant fibers, twisted and braided to create the necessary strength. The rigging required constant maintenance. Salt water and sun damaged the fibers, and lines had to be replaced regularly. Sailors developed specialized knowledge about which lines could be reused, which had to be replaced, and how to splice damaged sections to extend their useful life. The hull's sides featured a series of openings through which the oars extended. These openings, called ports or oar ports, were carefully positioned to allow the oars to move freely while maintaining the hull's structural integrity. The ports were not simple holes, but rather reinforced openings, with leather sleeves or wooden collars that prevented water from entering the hull while allowing the oars to pass through. The positioning of these ports determined the angle at which the oars entered the water, which in turn affected the efficiency of the rowing motion. The interior of the galley was divided into distinct spaces. Below the rowing deck lay the hold, where cargo was stored. This space was cramped and dark with minimal ventilation. Water inevitably accumulated in the bilge, the lowest point of the hull, and had to be pumped out regularly to prevent the cargo from becoming waterlogged. Above the rowing deck, the space between the oarsman and the rail was occupied by soldiers, supplies, and equipment. The stern castle contained cabins for the captain and senior officers, though these spaces were small and offered minimal comfort. The weight distribution within the galley required careful calculation. Too much weight forward and the bow would sink deeper into the water, reducing speed and maneuverability. Too much weight aft and the stern would sink, creating the same problems. The captain and the master, the senior officers responsible for the vessel's operation, understood these principles intuitively. They knew how to position cargo, how many rowers were needed for various conditions, and how to trim the vessel for optimal performance. This knowledge, accumulated through generations of experience, was passed from master to apprentice, from captain to junior officer. The galley was not a comfortable vessel, nor was it designed to be. Every element served a functional purpose. The narrow beam, the shallow draft, the exposed rowing deck, the minimal shelter, all reflected the priorities of speed, maneuverability, and combat capability. The galley sacrificed comfort and safety for performance. Those who served aboard it accepted this trade-off as the price of operating the most effective warship the Mediterranean had ever known. The galley was conceived as a weapon from its inception, and every aspect of its design reflected this fundamental purpose. The vessel's primary offensive capability lay not in projectiles or explosives, but in the ram, a reinforced projection extending from the bow that could splinter the hull of an opposing ship. The ram represented the culmination of centuries of naval warfare experience, refined through countless engagements into a tool of devastating effectiveness. When a galley accelerated toward an enemy vessel and struck with its full weight and momentum, the impact could tear open the hull, flooding the compartments below and rendering the ship incapable of remaining afloat. The ram itself was not a separate battering device, but rather an integral part of the bow structure. The timbers that formed the bow converged at a reinforced point, creating a projection that extended forward and downward. This projection was strengthened with additional layers of oak and other dense woods, making it capable of withstanding the enormous stresses generated during a ramming attack. The angle of the ram was critical. If it struck too high, it would merely graze the enemy hull. If it struck too low, it might pass beneath the vessel without causing significant damage. The optimal angle was slightly below the waterline, where a strike would penetrate the hull and allow water to flood into the ship's interior. The effectiveness of the ram depended on several factors. The galley needed sufficient speed to generate enough force to cause meaningful damage. The rowers had to coordinate their efforts precisely, pulling in unison to accelerate the vessel toward its target. The captain or the master had to judge the approach angle correctly, accounting for the movement of both vessels and the currents that might affect their trajectories. A successful ramming attack required skill, timing, and luck. Many ramming attempts failed because the attacking galley misjudged the distance, or the target vessel managed to evade at the last moment. Beyond the ram, galleys carried an array of hand-to-hand combat weapons. Soldiers aboard the vessel wielded swords, pikes, and axes. Crossbowmen occupied positions on the forecastle and stern castle, where they could rain bolts down upon enemy crews. As the 15th century progressed and firearms technology advanced, galleys began carrying arquebuses and muskets. These early firearms were slow to reload and unreliable in damp conditions, but they offered a significant advantage in range and penetrating power compared to arrows or bolts. The integration of firearms into galley warfare represented a gradual transition that would eventually transform naval combat entirely. The positioning of soldiers aboard a galley reflected tactical considerations. The forecastle, the raised platform at the bow, provided an elevated position from which defenders could attack approaching enemy vessels. Archers and crossbowmen stationed here could direct fire down upon enemy decks, creating casualties among the opposing crew before the vessels came into contact. The stern castle offered similar advantages, allowing defenders to maintain fire as enemy vessels attempted to approach from behind. The sides of the vessel, where the rowing deck was exposed, represented the most vulnerable points. Soldiers positioned along the rails could defend against boarding attempts, using pikes to keep enemy soldiers at a distance, while swordsmen engaged those who managed to cross onto the galley's deck. Some galleys carried siege equipment, particularly those operated by larger naval powers like Venice or the Ottoman Empire. Catapults and trebuchets could be mounted on the deck, allowing the galley to bombard fortified positions or other vessels from a distance. These weapons were cumbersome and required considerable space, so they were typically found only on larger galleys or on specialized vessels designed specifically for siege operations. The catapults fired stones or incendiary projectiles, creating casualties and damage that could weaken an enemy's defensive positions. The integration of cannons into galley warfare represented a significant development. Early cannons were unreliable, prone to explosion, and difficult to operate aboard a vessel where space was limited and movement was constant. Yet by the 16th century, galleys increasingly carried cannons mounted on the bow or stern. These cannons fired solid shot that could penetrate wooden hulls with far greater effectiveness than any medieval siege weapon. The cannons required trained crews to operate them safely and effectively, and the recoil generated by firing created stresses on the galley's structure that required reinforcement. The placement of cannons on a galley presented engineering challenges. The weapon's weight had to be distributed carefully to maintain the vessel's balance. The recoil had to be absorbed by the structure without causing damage. The crew operating the cannon required space to work, to load ammunition, and to aim the weapon. Most galleys carried only a few cannons, typically positioned on the bow or stern, where they could be aimed at approaching vessels. The development of specialized galley designs, with reinforced bows and sterns, reflected the increasing importance of cannon armament in naval warfare. The arsenal aboard a galley included not only weapons but also defensive equipment. Shields were stacked along the rails, providing protection for soldiers during combat. Nets could be rigged between the mast and the rails, creating barriers that made boarding attempts more difficult. Some galleys carried Greek fire or other incendiary substances, though the effectiveness of these weapons in combat was limited, and their use became less common as the medieval period progressed. The crew composition reflected the galley's dual nature as both a transport vessel and a warship. A typical galley carried between 150 and 250 oarsmen, whose primary responsibility was propelling the vessel. In addition to the rowers, the galley carried soldiers, typically between 30 and 100, depending on the vessel's size and the mission. These soldiers included officers, archers, crossbowmen, and pikemen. The ratio of soldiers to rowers varied depending on tactical considerations. A galley designed primarily for cargo transport might carry fewer soldiers, while a galley designed specifically for warfare might carry proportionally more. The captain commanded the vessel and made tactical decisions during combat. The master, a senior officer responsible for the vessel's operation, coordinated the rowers and managed the sailing of the galley. The boatswain, another senior officer, supervised the crew and maintained discipline. Below these officers were junior officers, petty officers, and skilled sailors who managed specific aspects of the vessel's operation. The soldiers aboard the galley operated under their own chain of command, typically led by a captain of soldiers who reported to the galley's captain. The effectiveness of a galley in combat depended not merely on its weapons, but on the coordination and training of its crew. Rowers had to respond instantly to commands, accelerating or decelerating the vessel as tactical situations demanded. Soldiers had to maintain discipline and execute maneuvers precisely. Archers had to aim accurately, despite the movement of the vessel beneath their feet. Officers had to make split-second decisions under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty. The galley that performed best in combat was not necessarily the one with the most impressive array of weapons, but rather the one whose crew operated with the greatest efficiency and coordination. Naval combats in the Mediterranean during the medieval period followed patterns that had evolved over centuries of warfare. The galley, despite its revolutionary design, did not fundamentally alter these patterns, but rather perfected them. A battle between galleys was not a chaotic melee, but rather a carefully orchestrated sequence of maneuvers, each designed to position one's own vessel for advantage while denying the enemy the same opportunity. Success in galley warfare depended on understanding wind and current, on reading the movements of opposing vessels, and on executing complex coordinated actions under extreme pressure. The preliminary phase of combat began long before vessels came into contact. Scouts and lookouts searched the horizon for enemy sails. When opposing fleets sighted one another, commanders assessed the situation, the number of enemy vessels, their apparent size and condition, the direction of wind and current, the position of the sun. These observations informed the tactical decisions that followed. A commander might choose to engage immediately if conditions favoured his fleet, or to manoeuvre for advantage, or to withdraw if the enemy appeared too formidable. The decision to fight or flee could determine the outcome of an entire campaign. As opposing galleys approached one another, the rowers accelerated their pace, pulling in unison to increase the vessel's speed. The rhythm of the oars was maintained by a drummer or a bosun who called out the cadence, ensuring that all rowers pulled together. Without this coordination, the oars would interfere with one another, creating turbulence rather than propulsion. The captain or master stood at a vantage point where he could observe the approaching enemy and communicate orders to the crew. The soldiers prepared their weapons, taking positions on the forecastle, stern castle, and along the rails. The approach to combat typically began with ranged attacks. Archers and crossbowmen on both vessels directed fire at one another, attempting to create casualties among the opposing crew before the vessels came into contact. These preliminary volleys served multiple purposes. They created confusion and fear among the enemy crew. They eliminated or wounded soldiers who might otherwise participate in hand-to-hand combat. They tested the enemy's defensive capabilities and revealed the positions of key personnel. A skilled archer could identify and target officers or other high-value targets, potentially disrupting the enemy's command structure. The ramming attack represented the most decisive moment in galley combat. The attacking galley accelerated toward its target, aiming to strike the enemy vessel's hull at an angle that would maximize damage. The defenders attempted to evade by maneuvering their vessel or by creating obstacles that would deflect the incoming galley. The rowers on both vessels pulled with maximum effort, straining to achieve the speed necessary for either attack or evasion. The moment of impact generated tremendous force, shaking both vessels violently. Rowers were thrown from their benches. Loose objects tumbled across the deck. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the water. If the ramming attack succeeded in breaching the hull, the battle often ended quickly. The damaged vessel began to sink, and the surviving crew either surrendered or attempted to escape by swimming or by boarding the attacking galley. If the ramming attack failed to cause sufficient damage, the battle continued. The two vessels might separate and attempt additional ramming attacks, or they might come alongside one another, allowing soldiers to board and engage in hand-to-hand combat. Boarding actions represented the most brutal phase of galley combat. Soldiers from one vessel attempted to cross onto the enemy galley, either by jumping across the narrow gap between vessels or by using boarding bridges or grappling hooks. The defenders attempted to prevent this crossing, using pikes to keep attackers at a distance and swords to cut down those who managed to reach the deck. The fighting was intense and chaotic, with soldiers struggling for footing on a deck that was often slick with blood or seawater. Officers attempted to maintain some semblance of organisation, but once hand-to-hand combat began, control became difficult. The rowers, meanwhile, remained at their benches, continuing to row even as combat raged above them. They could hear the sounds of fighting but could see little of what was occurring. They responded to commands from the boatswain or other officers, accelerating or decelerating the vessel as tactical situations demanded. If the vessel was captured, the rowers faced a terrible choice. They could attempt to escape, knowing that capture likely meant enslavement, or they could continue rowing under their new masters. Many rowers chose to fight rather than surrender, using their oars as weapons or attempting to flee the vessel. The outcome of a galley battle depended on numerous factors. The skill and experience of the commanders influenced tactical decisions. The training and discipline of the crew affected how well coordinated maneuvers could be executed. The condition of the vessels, whether they were seaworthy and in good repair, determined how effectively they could maneuver. The weather and sea conditions could favour one side or the other. A galley that was faster and more manoeuvrable could potentially avoid ramming attacks, and instead position itself to attack the enemy from a favourable angle. A galley with a larger crew of experienced soldiers might prevail in boarding actions even if its vessel was less manoeuvrable. Communication during combat presented significant challenges. The noise of battle made verbal commands difficult to hear. Officers used drums, whistles, and hand signals to communicate with crew members. The pattern of drum beats conveyed specific commands: accelerate, decelerate, prepare for ramming, repel boarders. Experienced crews recognized these signals instantly and responded without hesitation. Crews lacking such training were at a severe disadvantage, as confusion about what was expected could lead to disorganization and defeat. The aftermath of a galley battle was often as brutal as the combat itself. Survivors of the losing vessel faced several fates. Some were killed outright by victorious soldiers. Others were captured and enslaved, particularly if they were skilled rowers, or if they came from a culture or religion that made them valuable as slaves. Officers and soldiers of high rank might be ransomed if their families or governments could afford the price. The common soldiers and rowers, if they survived capture, typically faced enslavement or execution. The victorious galley, even in success, often suffered significant damage. The ramming attack that breached an enemy hull could damage the attacking vessel as well. The recoil from the impact could crack timbers or loosen the fastenings that held the hull together. Fires could break out during combat, particularly if incendiary projectiles were used. The victorious crew had to assess the damage to their vessel and determine whether it could continue operating or whether it needed to return to port for repairs. Historians still debate the relative effectiveness of different galley tactics. Some evidence suggests that ramming attacks were less decisive than commanders believed, and that many battles were ultimately decided by boarding actions and hand-to-hand combat. Other sources indicate that successful ramming attacks were indeed devastating, capable of sinking vessels outright or rendering them incapable of continued combat. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes, with the outcome of any particular battle depending on the specific circumstances and the capabilities of the vessels and crews involved. The galley functioned as a complex social organism, with each person occupying a specific role within a rigid hierarchy. At the apex stood the captain, a figure of considerable authority who commanded the vessel and made decisions affecting everyone aboard. The captain answered to higher authorities, the merchant who owned the galley, the government that commissioned it, or the military commander under whose orders it operated. Below the captain came the master, responsible for the vessel's navigation and the coordination of its crew. The master possessed extensive knowledge of seamanship, weather patterns, and the Mediterranean's coastlines and currents. This knowledge was invaluable, and masters were among the most respected and well-compensated members of the crew. The boatswain occupied a position of considerable importance, serving as the intermediary between officers and the common crew. The boatswain maintained discipline, ensured that orders were executed promptly, and managed the day-to-day operations of the vessel. The boatswain's authority was enforced through punishment. Flogging was the standard response to disobedience or negligence. The threat of punishment maintained order aboard a vessel where close quarters and dangerous conditions could easily generate conflict. The boatswain's whistle, a distinctive sound that cut through the noise of the rowing deck, conveyed commands that every crew member understood. Below these senior officers came junior officers and petty officers, the quartermaster, the carpenter, the sailmaker, the cook. Each possessed specialized knowledge necessary for the galley's operation. The carpenter maintained the hull and the wooden structures, making repairs and ensuring that the vessel remained seaworthy. The sailmaker maintained the sail and the rigging, replacing worn lines and repairing damage caused by weather or combat. The quartermaster managed supplies and provisions, calculating how long the galley could remain at sea, given the current level of stores. These specialized roles were filled by experienced sailors who had spent years learning their craft. The rowers formed the largest group aboard the galley, typically comprising between 150 and 250 individuals, depending on the vessel's size. The rowers were not a homogeneous group, but rather a collection of individuals from diverse backgrounds and circumstances. Some were free men who chose rowing as a profession, attracted by the wages and the opportunity for advancement. These professional rowers were valued for their experience and their understanding of the coordinated movements necessary to propel the galley efficiently. They could be promoted to positions of responsibility, becoming rowing masters or officers. Other rowers were conscripted or pressed into service. Governments sometimes required able-bodied men to serve as rowers for a specified period, typically 1 or 2 years. These conscripted rowers had little choice in the matter. They were selected by officials and compelled to serve. Some came from the lower classes of society, men without property or prospects who were vulnerable to conscription. Others came from rural areas where they had been farmers or labourers. The transition from land-based life to the rowing deck was often traumatic, and many conscripted rowers struggled to adapt to the physical demands and the rigid discipline of galley life. A third category consisted of criminals and prisoners. Governments sometimes offered prisoners the choice between execution and service as a galley rower. Some accepted this offer, viewing it as a chance at redemption or at least survival. Others were forced into service without being offered a choice. These criminal rowers were often considered unreliable and dangerous, and they were watched carefully by officers and guards. Yet many criminal rowers served competently, and some eventually earned their freedom through years of faithful service. The fourth category, enslaved rowers, represented a significant portion of the rowing force, particularly in galleys operated by Mediterranean powers that engaged in slave trading. These individuals had been captured in warfare, purchased from slave traders, or born into slavery. They had no legal rights and no prospect of freedom except through ransom or escape. The conditions they endured were often the most brutal, as they were considered expendable in ways that free rowers were not. The physical demands of rowing were extraordinary. A rower sat on a bench for hours at a time, pulling an oar that weighed considerable weight. The motion was repetitive and exhausting, engaging the legs, back and arms in a coordinated effort. The pace was maintained by a drummer or a boatswain who called out the rhythm, ensuring that all rowers pulled in unison. The drummer's beat might accelerate during combat, or when the galley needed to move quickly, or it might slow during periods of cruising. The rowers responded to these changes, adjusting their pace instantly. A rower who could not maintain the pace, or who pulled out of rhythm, disrupted the entire rowing effort and faced punishment. The watch system divided the rowers into groups that rotated between active rowing and rest. A typical watch might last 4 hours, after which the rowers would be relieved by a fresh group. This rotation allowed rowers to recover somewhat, though the recovery period was often inadequate for full restoration of strength. Rowers who were sick or injured might be forced to continue working despite their condition, or they might be removed from the rowing deck entirely if their condition prevented them from contributing. Those removed from service faced an uncertain fate. They might recover and return to rowing, or they might be discarded at the next port. The soldiers aboard the galley occupied a different social position than the rowers. Soldiers were typically free men, often drawn from the military classes or from families with military traditions. They received training in weapons and combat tactics, and they were organized into units with their own chain of command. The captain of soldiers reported to the galley's captain and was responsible for the conduct and readiness of his men. Soldiers received higher wages than rowers and were afforded somewhat better treatment, though conditions aboard the galley were harsh for everyone. The relationship between rowers and soldiers was complex. The soldiers depended on the rowers to propel the galley and to maneuver it during combat. The rowers depended on the soldiers to defend them from enemy attack. Yet there was also tension between the groups. Soldiers sometimes viewed rowers with contempt, particularly if the rowers were enslaved or of lower social status. Rowers sometimes resented the soldiers, viewing them as privileged individuals who did not understand the hardship of rowing. This tension occasionally erupted into conflict, though officers typically intervened to prevent open violence. The captain maintained order through a combination of authority, punishment, and incentive. Rowers who performed well might receive extra rations or reduced watch duties. Those who performed poorly or who disobeyed orders faced flogging or other punishments. The captain understood that maintaining morale was crucial for the galley's effectiveness. A crew that was demoralized or resentful would not perform well in combat or during difficult conditions. Thus, while punishment was used to enforce discipline, the captain also recognized the value of treating the crew reasonably and ensuring that they understood the importance of their role. The hierarchy aboard the galley reflected broader social structures of medieval Mediterranean society. Officers came from higher social classes and possessed education and training. Skilled sailors and specialists occupied a middle position, valued for their knowledge and experience. Common rowers occupied the lowest position, particularly if they were enslaved or conscripted. Yet within this rigid hierarchy, individuals could sometimes improve their circumstances through skill, loyalty, or luck. A rower who demonstrated exceptional ability might be promoted to a position of responsibility. A soldier who showed courage in combat might advance in rank. The galley, despite its brutality, offered some possibility for social mobility to those who survived its demands. The galley's dominance in Mediterranean warfare rested fundamentally on the labour of enslaved rowers. While some galleys employed free rowers or conscripted men, the most powerful naval forces increasingly relied on enslaved individuals to fill the rowing benches. This reliance on slavery transformed the galley from merely a vessel of war into an instrument of systematic exploitation. The sources of enslaved rowers were diverse and reflected the complex networks of warfare, commerce, and human trafficking that characterized the medieval Mediterranean. Warfare generated a constant supply of captives, When Christian forces defeated Muslim armies, they captured soldiers and civilians who could be enslaved. When Muslim forces defeated Christian armies, they captured their enemies for the same purpose. This cycle of capture and enslavement had persisted for centuries, creating a brutal economy in which human beings became commodities. The captives were transported to slave markets in cities like Venice, Genoa, Alexandria, and Constantinople, where they were sold to the highest bidder. Galley owners and naval commanders purchased these captives, viewing them as a renewable resource that could be exploited until they died or became too weak to row. Beyond war captives, enslaved rowers came from other sources. Pirates and slave traders raided coastal settlements, capturing men, women, and children for sale in slave markets. Criminals convicted of serious offences were sometimes sentenced to slavery, their labour serving as punishment for their crimes. Individuals who could not pay debts sometimes entered slavery as a means of satisfying their creditors. Children born to enslaved mothers were themselves enslaved from birth, inheriting their parents' status. The result was a diverse population of enslaved rowers, drawn from multiple cultures, religions, and social backgrounds, united only by their lack of freedom and their confinement to the rowing deck. The conditions endured by enslaved rowers were extraordinarily harsh. The rowing deck was a confined space where dozens or hundreds of individuals sat in close proximity for hours at a time. Ventilation was minimal, and the air became thick with sweat, urine, and feces. The temperature rose dramatically in summer, creating an environment that was simultaneously suffocating and nauseating. Enslaved rowers were typically chained to their benches or to one another, preventing escape or resistance. The chains were heavy and uncomfortable, chafing the skin and restricting movement. A rower who became ill or injured while chained had no way to relieve his suffering or to seek assistance. The diet provided to enslaved rowers was minimal and often inadequate. A typical ration consisted of hard biscuit, salted fish or meat, and small quantities of wine or water. This diet was sufficient to maintain basic bodily functions, but insufficient to fully restore the energy expended through hours of rowing. Rowers grew progressively weaker over time, their bodies consuming their own muscle tissue to fuel continued exertion. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, making rowers susceptible to disease. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, became endemic among crews that spent extended periods at sea without access to fresh fruits or vegetables. Scurvy caused bleeding gums, loose teeth, and eventually death if left untreated. Disease spread rapidly in the confined environment of the rowing deck. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water or food, swept through the crew, causing severe diarrhea and dehydration. Typhus, transmitted by lice that infested the unwashed bodies of the rowers, created fever and delirium. Plague, the most devastating disease of the medieval period, occasionally appeared aboard galleys, killing rowers with terrifying speed. Tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases thrived in the poorly ventilated rowing deck. Medical care was virtually non-existent. A rower who became seriously ill was typically left to recover or die without intervention. The mortality rate among enslaved rowers was staggering, with some estimates suggesting that a significant percentage of the enslaved population died each year from disease, malnutrition, or exhaustion. The psychological toll of slavery was as severe as the physical suffering. Enslaved rowers were stripped of their freedom and their dignity, reduced to the status of living tools whose sole purpose was to propel the galley. They had no control over their lives, no ability to make decisions about their own welfare, no prospect of improvement. Many rowers fell into despair, losing the will to live. Some attempted suicide, either by refusing to eat or by attempting to escape the galley by jumping into the sea. Others became withdrawn and unresponsive, their minds retreating from the horror of their circumstances. Officers and guards responded to such behaviour with punishment, viewing it as disobedience rather than as evidence of psychological distress. Resistance among enslaved rowers took various forms. Some attempted escape, either by fleeing the galley when it was in port or by jumping overboard during voyages. Most such escape attempts failed, and those captured attempting to escape faced severe punishment, flogging, mutilation, or execution. Other rowers engaged in subtle forms of resistance, working slowly or deliberately, pulling out of rhythm to disrupt the rowing effort. This form of resistance was difficult to detect and punish, but it was also less effective than outright escape. Some rowers organized collective resistance, planning coordinated uprisings or mutinies. These organized resistance efforts occasionally succeeded in seizing control of a galley, though the participants typically faced execution if they were recaptured. The moral paradox of galley slavery was profound. Christian galleys enslaved Muslims captured in warfare or purchased from slave traders. Muslim galleys enslaved Christians in exactly the same manner. Both sides justified this practice through religious doctrine, viewing enslavement of the enemy as legitimate and even virtuous. Both sides rationalized the brutal conditions endured by enslaved rowers as necessary for the maintenance of naval power. The hypocrisy was evident to contemporaries, yet it persisted because the economic and military benefits of slavery outweighed any moral objections. Redemption systems existed in some Mediterranean cities, offering enslaved rowers the possibility of freedom through ransom. Religious organizations, particularly the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians, collected funds to ransom enslaved Christians from Muslim galleys. Muslim organizations performed similar functions for enslaved Muslims. Yet redemption was typically available only to those with family connections or religious affiliations that made them valuable enough to ransom. The vast majority of enslaved rowers lacked such connections and remained enslaved until death. The transition away from slavery in galley warfare occurred gradually over several centuries. As galleys became less central to naval warfare, and as attitudes towards slavery shifted, the reliance on enslaved rowers declined. By the 18th century, most galleys employed free rowers or conscripted men rather than enslaved individuals. Yet this transition did not reflect a moral awakening so much as a practical recognition that free rowers, motivated by wages and the possibility of advancement, were more efficient and reliable than enslaved rowers who had no incentive to perform well. The legacy of galley slavery persisted long after the galleys themselves became obsolete. The experience of enslaved rowers revealed the capacity of human societies to rationalize extraordinary cruelty in service of practical objectives. It demonstrated how economic systems could override moral considerations, transforming human beings into commodities to be exploited and discarded. The suffering endured by enslaved rowers, though largely forgotten by history, represented one of the most systematic and prolonged forms of human exploitation in the medieval Mediterranean world. A galley at sea existed in a state of perpetual crisis. The vessel carried limited supplies, and every day of voyage consumed those supplies at a fixed rate. The quartermaster, the officer responsible for provisions, calculated how long the galley could remain at sea based on the current quantity of stores and the size of the crew. This calculation determined the galley's range and operational capability. A galley that could remain at sea for only 2 weeks was far more limited than one capable of operating for 2 months. The difference between these capabilities could determine the outcome of military campaigns and the success of trading voyages. Water represented the most critical supply. A human being requires approximately 1 gallon of water per day for basic survival, more in hot climates or during periods of physical exertion. A galley carrying 200 rowers and crew members required 400 gallons of water daily. Water was stored in wooden barrels, which were heavy and occupied considerable space. The barrels themselves presented problems. Wood could rot, and water stored in wooden containers could become contaminated with splinters or with organisms that caused disease. Water stored for extended periods developed a foul taste and odour, making it difficult for crew members to consume adequate quantities. Some galleys carried wine or beer as supplements to water, as these fermented beverages were less likely to become contaminated than water alone. The provisioning of food followed similar constraints. The galley carried hard biscuit, a dense bread that could be stored for extended periods without spoiling. The biscuit was often infested with weevils and other insects, and crew members learned to tap the biscuit against the table to dislodge the insects before eating. Salted fish and salted meat provided protein but contributed to dehydration and to the development of scurvy. Dried peas and beans offered some nutritional value but required cooking, which consumed fresh water and fuel. Cheese, dried fruit, and nuts supplemented the basic rations, though these items were expensive and typically reserved for officers or for special occasions. The preparation of food aboard a galley presented significant challenges. The galley, the ship's kitchen, was a small space where a cook prepared meals for hundreds of individuals. The galley contained a brick oven or a metal stove where fires could be maintained. During calm weather, the cook could prepare hot meals. During storms or rough seas, fires could not be safely maintained, and crew members subsisted on cold rations. The cook's role was crucial. A competent cook could make limited provisions palatable and could stretch supplies to feed the crew adequately. A poor cook could create conditions where crew members became malnourished despite adequate supplies. Scurvy emerged as one of the most devastating diseases affecting galley crews. The disease resulted from vitamin C deficiency, which occurred when crews spent extended periods without access to fresh fruits or vegetables. Scurvy began with fatigue and joint pain, progressed to bleeding gums and loose teeth, and eventually resulted in death if left untreated. The disease was particularly prevalent among crews that remained at sea for months at a time. Some galley commanders recognized the connection between fresh provisions and the prevention of scurvy, and they made efforts to obtain fresh fruits and vegetables whenever the galley reached port. Others did not understand the cause of the disease and could only watch helplessly as crew members sickened and died. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water or spoiled food, swept through galleys with terrifying regularity. The disease caused severe diarrhea and dehydration, weakening those afflicted and often resulting in death. The confined conditions of the galley, where sanitation was minimal and waste disposal was problematic, created ideal conditions for the spread of dysentery. A single infected individual could transmit the disease to dozens of others within days. Officers sometimes attempted to isolate the sick, but this was difficult in the cramped quarters of a galley. The disease spread through the crew, incapacitating rowers and soldiers alike. Typhus, transmitted by lice that infested the unwashed bodies of crew members, created fever, delirium, and often death. The disease was particularly prevalent during winter months, when crew members wore heavy clothing and bathing became infrequent. Lice infested the clothing and the bedding, and scratching the itching bites created wounds that could become infected. Some galleys attempted to control lice infestations by periodically boiling clothing or by requiring crew members to shave their heads and bodies, but these measures were only partially effective. Typhus killed thousands of galley crew members throughout the medieval period, often causing more casualties than combat. Plague occasionally appeared aboard galleys, particularly during periods when the disease was prevalent in Mediterranean ports. A single infected individual could introduce plague to an entire crew. The disease spread rapidly in the confined environment, killing rowers and soldiers with terrifying speed. Some galley commanders, recognizing the danger, attempted to isolate plague victims or to quarantine the galley, but these measures were often ineffective. Entire crews sometimes perished from plague, leaving the galley a floating tomb that drifted until it was discovered and salvaged or sank. Sanitation aboard a galley was primitive at best. Crew members defecated over the side of the vessel or into designated areas that quickly became filthy. Urine accumulated in the bilge, the lowest point of the hull, creating a foul-smelling sludge that bred disease-carrying organisms. Washing was infrequent, as fresh water was too valuable to waste on hygiene. Crew members wore the same clothing for weeks or months, accumulating sweat, dirt, and parasites. The combination of poor sanitation, inadequate hygiene, and confined quarters created conditions where disease thrived. The mortality rate aboard galleys was staggering. Some estimates suggest that 10 to 20% of galley crews died each year from disease, malnutrition, or other causes. In particularly severe cases, mortality rates exceeded 50%. The galley was not merely a workplace, but a death trap, where the combination of physical exertion, inadequate nutrition, poor sanitation, and confined quarters created conditions that were nearly incompatible with human survival. Officers and commanders understood that maintaining crew morale was essential for the galley's effectiveness. A crew that was demoralized or physically weakened could not row effectively or fight competently. Yet the conditions aboard the galley made it difficult to maintain morale. Crew members watched their companions sicken and die. They endured hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. They lived in constant fear of disease or injury. Some commanders attempted to improve conditions by ensuring adequate provisions, by maintaining sanitation as much as possible, and by treating the sick with whatever care was available. Others viewed crew members as expendable and made little effort to preserve their welfare. The psychological toll of galley service extended beyond the immediate experience of hardship. Survivors of galley service often carried psychological scars that persisted for years after leaving the vessel. Those who had been enslaved faced the trauma of captivity and the loss of freedom. Those who had witnessed the deaths of companions struggled with grief and survivor's guilt. The experience of galley service transformed individuals, marking them permanently with the knowledge of human suffering and the fragility of life. By the 14th century, the galley transformed from a specialized vessel into the instrument through which Mediterranean powers projected authority across open water. Venice and Genoa, two merchant republics whose wealth derived from trade, recognized that naval supremacy determined commercial dominance. These cities invested vast resources into shipyard construction, establishing facilities capable of producing dozens of galleys annually. The arsenal in Venice, a sprawling complex of workshops and docks, employed thousands of workers engaged in the construction and maintenance of naval vessels. The productivity of such shipyards reflected the centrality of galley fleets to state power. The Ottoman Empire, consolidating control over the eastern Mediterranean during the 15th century, understood that galley fleets represented the foundation of imperial authority. Ottoman sultans commissioned the construction of hundreds of galleys, creating a naval force capable of projecting power from the Balkans to North Africa. The Ottoman galley fleet served multiple purposes simultaneously. It protected merchant shipping under Ottoman control, it suppressed piracy and rival maritime activity, it enforced Ottoman claims to territorial waters, and it provided the primary instrument for waging naval warfare against Christian powers. The Kingdom of Spain, particularly after the Union of Castile and Aragon in 1479, developed significant galley capabilities to protect its Mediterranean interests and to contest Ottoman dominance. Spanish shipyards in Barcelona, Valencia, and other ports produced galleys of exceptional quality. Spanish commanders, including the celebrated Don John of Austria, demonstrated tactical brilliance in deploying galley fleets against Ottoman forces. The rivalry between Spain and the Ottoman Empire for control of Mediterranean trade and territory drove continuous innovation in galley design and tactics. The economic foundation supporting galley fleets rested on merchant trade. Merchant galleys, vessels designed to carry cargo while retaining the speed and maneuverability of warships, transported goods throughout the Mediterranean. These merchant vessels moved spices from the Levant, grain from North Africa, timber from the Balkans, and manufactured goods from Italian cities. The value of this trade justified enormous expenditures on naval protection. Merchant convoys travelled under escort of war galleys, which protected them from pirates and from attacks by rival powers. The security provided by these escorts allowed merchants to conduct business with greater confidence, knowing their investments would not be seized or destroyed. Piracy represented a constant threat to merchant shipping. Pirates operating from coastal strongholds and island bases preyed on merchant vessels, capturing cargo and holding crews for ransom. These pirates ranged from organized corsairs operating under the nominal authority of larger powers to independent brigands seeking personal enrichment. Galley fleets conducted systematic operations against pirate bases, destroying ships and fortifications and capturing or executing pirates. The scale of anti-piracy operations reflected the magnitude of the piracy problem. Venice maintained permanent squadrons of galleys specifically tasked with suppressing piracy in the Adriatic and the eastern Mediterranean. The enforcement of trade monopolies represented a more controversial application of galley power. Venice, Genoa, and other merchant republics used their naval fleets to prevent rival merchants from accessing certain markets or trading in specific goods. Venetian galleys patrolled the eastern Mediterranean, intercepting merchant vessels from rival cities and confiscating cargo deemed to violate Venetian trade monopolies. This practice generated enormous wealth for the dominant merchant republics, but created resentment among excluded competitors. The tension between rival merchant powers occasionally erupted into open warfare, with galley fleets clashing in battles that determined control of trade routes and access to markets. The transition of galley warfare from small-scale skirmishes to large-scale fleet battles occurred gradually. Early medieval galley combat typically involved relatively small numbers of vessels engaged in individual encounters. By the 15th century, galley fleets numbering in the dozens or hundreds clashed in coordinated battles. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 represented the culmination of this development, the largest galley battle ever fought and the most dramatic demonstration of galley fleet power. The Christian alliance that assembled to confront Ottoman expansion consisted of Venice, Spain, the Papal States, and various Italian powers. Don John of Austria, a capable commander with significant military experience, was appointed to lead the combined Christian fleet. The Christian fleet assembled approximately 200 galleys and galleots, smaller vessels similar to galleys but with different rigging and armament. The Ottoman fleet, commanded by Ali Pasha, consisted of approximately 230 galleys and other vessels. Both fleets represented enormous investments of resources and represented the accumulated naval power of their respective civilizations. The two fleets clashed in the Gulf of Patras, off the coast of Greece, on October 7, 1571. The battle lasted several hours and involved thousands of combatants engaged in intense hand-to-hand combat. The Christian fleet achieved victory, destroying or capturing the majority of the Ottoman vessels and killing or capturing thousands of Ottoman soldiers and rowers. The Christian victory at Lepanto was celebrated throughout Europe as a triumph of Christian civilization over Ottoman expansion. Historians still debate the strategic significance of the victory, with some arguing that it represented a decisive turning point in Mediterranean history, and others contending that its impact was more limited than contemporaries believed. The aftermath of Lepanto revealed important truths about galley warfare and naval power. The Ottoman Empire, despite the loss of its fleet, quickly rebuilt its naval forces. Within a few years, the Ottomans had constructed new galleys and had restored their naval capability to pre-battle levels. The Christian alliance, lacking the unified command structure and the economic resources to maintain a permanent fleet, gradually dissolved. Venice and Spain pursued their own interests, sometimes cooperating and sometimes competing. The result was that Ottoman naval power, though temporarily diminished, recovered and eventually reasserted itself in the Mediterranean. The period following Lepanto witnessed the gradual decline of galley warfare. Larger sailing ships particularly galleons and other vessels designed for ocean voyages, became increasingly important in naval warfare. These vessels carried more cannons than galleys could accommodate and could operate effectively in the open ocean where galleys struggled. The development of more effective cannons and the increasing sophistication of naval gunnery reduced the effectiveness of ramming tactics and boarding actions that had characterized galley warfare. Commanders began to recognize that naval battles would be decided by cannon fire rather than by the traditional galley tactics of ramming and boarding. The transition away from galleys occurred over several decades. Some naval powers maintained galley fleets well into the 17th century, but their importance declined steadily. By the 18th century, galleys had become obsolete, replaced entirely by sailing ships and later by steam-powered vessels. The galley's dominance in Mediterranean warfare, which had lasted more than 3 centuries, came to an end as technological change and shifting tactical doctrines rendered it ineffective. The galley disappeared from the world's oceans, yet its influence persisted in ways that extended far beyond the maritime sphere. The vessel represented a particular moment in human history when technological innovation, economic necessity, and military ambition converged to create something unprecedented. The galley embodied principles that would shape naval design for centuries to come, long after the galley itself became obsolete. Naval architects studying the hydrodynamics of the galley's hull recognized principles that applied to all vessels: the efficiency of the galley's form, the relationship between length and beam, the advantages of a shallow draft in certain conditions. These insights influenced the design of subsequent generations of ships. The organizational systems developed to manage galley crews established patterns that persisted in naval organizations throughout the modern era. The hierarchical structure aboard the galley, with clear chains of command and specialized roles, became the model for naval organization in subsequent centuries. The watch system, the division of crew into rotating groups responsible for different tasks, originated in galley practice and persisted in naval vessels long after galleys disappeared. The signals and communication systems developed to coordinate galley crews influenced the development of naval signaling systems that remained in use into the 20th century. The galley's reliance on enslaved labor represented an extreme form of labor exploitation, yet it illuminated principles that would characterize industrial labor systems centuries later. The galley demonstrated how human beings could be treated as interchangeable components in a larger system, how their suffering could be rationalized as necessary for the achievement of larger objectives, and how economic systems could override moral considerations. These principles, refined and systematized, would reappear in the industrial factories of the 19th century and in the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. The galley was not the origin of such exploitation, but it represented one of the most systematic and prolonged examples of it in the pre-industrial world. The technological innovations associated with galley warfare influenced the development of subsequent military technologies. The ram, refined through centuries of galley combat, represented an early form of the battering ram that would be used in siege warfare. The integration of cannons into galley design represented one of the first attempts to combine traditional weapons with emerging firearm technology. The tactical principles developed in galley warfare, the importance of positioning, the coordination of multiple units, the integration of different types of weapons, influenced the development of land-based military tactics as well. Military commanders studying galley tactics recognized principles that could be applied to land warfare, and they adapted these principles to their own contexts. The economic systems that supported galley fleets established patterns of state investment in military technology that would persist into the modern era. The arsenal in Venice represented one of the first large-scale industrial facilities, employing thousands of workers engaged in standardized production. The organizational systems developed to manage the arsenal influenced the development of subsequent industrial production systems. The relationship between state power and naval capability, established through galley warfare, became a fundamental principle of international relations. Nations that sought to exercise power beyond their borders recognized that naval capability was essential, and they invested enormous resources in the construction and maintenance of naval fleets. The cultural legacy of galley warfare persisted in the Mediterranean world long after galleys themselves disappeared. The galley became a symbol of maritime power and of the connection between the sea and human civilization. Mediterranean cities that had built their wealth on galley trade and galley warfare maintained cultural traditions that celebrated this heritage. Venice preserved the memory of its galley fleets through art, architecture, and ceremony. The Venetian arsenal, though no longer producing galleys, remained a symbol of the city's maritime power and its technological sophistication. The galley appeared in paintings, sculptures, and literary works, representing an idealized vision of maritime heroism and power. The voices of those who lived and died aboard galleys largely disappeared from historical record. The vast majority of galley rowers, particularly those who were enslaved, left no written accounts of their experiences. The officers and commanders who survived battles sometimes recorded their observations, but the perspective of the common rower remained largely absent from historical documentation. Modern historians have attempted to reconstruct the experiences of galley crews through indirect evidence: archaeological remains of galleys, written accounts by officers and observers, records of provisions and supplies, demographic data about mortality rates. Yet significant gaps remain in our understanding of what galley service meant to those who experienced it directly. The rediscovery of galley remains through underwater archaeology has provided new insights into galley construction and operation. Wrecks of galleys that sank centuries ago have been excavated and studied, revealing details about hull construction, rigging systems, and the organization of space aboard the vessel. These archaeological investigations have confirmed many details recorded in historical documents and have revealed aspects of galley design that were not explicitly documented in written sources. The material evidence provided by archaeology offers a perspective that complements and sometimes challenges the written historical record. The galley's transition from dominance to obsolescence occurred not through a single dramatic event, but through a gradual process of technological change and shifting military priorities. The development of more effective cannons reduced the advantage that the galley's maneuverability had provided. The emergence of larger sailing ships capable of carrying more cannons and of operating effectively in open ocean environments created alternatives to the galley. The changing nature of maritime trade, as European powers began conducting commerce with distant continents across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, reduced the importance of Mediterranean trade routes, where galleys had dominated. The combination of these factors gradually rendered the galley obsolete. The study of galley warfare illuminates fundamental truths about the relationship between technology and human society. Technological innovations do not emerge in isolation, but rather arise in response to specific needs and circumstances. The galley emerged because Mediterranean powers required a vessel that could operate effectively in confined waters and that could serve simultaneously as a transport vessel and as a warship. The galley persisted for centuries because it fulfilled these requirements effectively. The galley declined when technological changes and shifting circumstances rendered it less effective than alternative solutions. The galley also reveals the human cost of technological innovation and military power. The vessel's effectiveness rested fundamentally on the suffering of those who rowed it. The pursuit of naval dominance required the enslavement and exploitation of thousands of individuals. The maintenance of galley fleets consumed enormous resources that might have been directed toward other purposes. The warfare conducted with galley fleets resulted in the deaths of thousands of combatants and the displacement of countless civilians. The galley's legacy includes not only its contributions to naval design and military organization, but also the suffering it inflicted on those who served aboard it. The Mediterranean world that the galley dominated has transformed dramatically since the galley's decline. The balance of power has shifted repeatedly as different nations and empires have risen and fallen. The economic systems that supported galley trade have been replaced by different systems of commerce and exchange. The cultural and religious conflicts that characterized galley warfare have evolved into different forms, yet the fundamental importance of naval power in determining international relations persists. Nations that seek to exercise power beyond their borders continue to invest in naval capabilities. The principles established through galley warfare, that control of the sea determines control of trade, that naval power projects state authority, that technological innovation provides military advantage, remain relevant in the modern world.